Good morning, everyone. So we'll jump right into the second panel. I'm Bill Roebuck. I'm the Executive Vice President at AGSI, and we're delighted to have you here today and to launch this second panel. We're focusing on the geopolitics out in the region. Let me just quickly, I think you have the access to the bios for everyone, but just a quick handle on each person I'm delighted to be on the panel with today. Mona Yacoubian is a senior advisor and the director of the Middle East program at CSIS. Welcome, Mona. Alan Eyre is the distinguished diplomatic fellow at MEI, and he's the founder and president of Eyre Analytics, and he's a long-serving previous State Department official. And Kristin Diwan is a senior resident scholar at AGSI. So obviously the geopolitical subject of the day is Iran in the region. We're going to drill down a little bit on that crisis and talk about it. We're also going to spend some time later in the discussion talking about some of the other geopolitical issues that are on the agenda, so to speak, out in the region that officials, people, ordinary people focus on. That includes the war in Gaza, which is a big issue. The challenge posed by the Houthis to maritime security and also as a political problem. And then off in the distance, there's the situation in Syria and how the Gulf has engaged with Syria in the past, and will that continue? So our focus with this panel is going to be geopolitical developments. We'll tee up some specific inquiries that I think some of our experts can handle later today on some of the energy and oil price issues. Thus far, looking at it as a non-expert, it seems like the impact on oil prices has been a bit muted in given the size of this crisis in the past couple of weeks, but we'll see how that goes. So the matter at hand is the Iran crisis. We'll start with that with our members of the panel. I would just say, it's amazing what one day a difference it makes in seeing how things develop. We've seen reports now, of course, of a ceasefire offered by President Trump and agreed to by Iran and Israel, and then subsequent reports of the ceasefire being violated and missile attacks being, or air attacks targeting each country, and with reports of casualties, at least on the Israeli side, of 4 killed down in southern Israel in the Beersheba area. So there's a lot of questions about the status of the ceasefire and how it's going to move forward, the impact of it, and we'll talk about that some as we dig into this issue. Also, it's going to be useful to discuss the issue of diplomacy and what kind of role that's going to have and how they're going to shape the diplomatic effort going forward. Who are going to be the players that will shape it? Will there be bystanders who are immensely interested in it but not really playing a part? All of those issues are going to help shape the diplomacy. There's the question of will Iran be forced into some sort of coercive diplomacy that will require intrusive inspections by the IAEA. That's a big issue that's going to be dealt with. What is the status of Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei? Is a succession plan already in place? Is it already being implemented? That folds into the bigger issue of what has been discussed a lot in recent days of regime change, and we'll consider that. What kind of regime change was being talked about? Is there some sort of slow-moving regime change that has already begun to occur in Iran? Or has it, in fact, despite all this crisis, despite all the pressure that the regime has been under, hasn't the regime shown quite a bit of cohesiveness and ability to survive under intense pressure? So we'll look at all that. Delighted to be with you, members of the panel. Alan, maybe I'll start with you as our someone who has focused on the Iran issue for so many years. and has also devoted a big part of your life to learning about Iran, speaking the language. Let me ask you first if you can just, in all this dizzying development in the past 2 weeks and the events that took place before, catch us up a little bit. What do you see since these June 13 attacks that are the key developments, and of things I mentioned or other issues, what do you see as the key issues that are going to need to be looked at going forward?
First of all, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure seeing so many longtime friends around the table who I've not seen in a while. Increasingly uncertain times in the Middle East and with Iran, that certainly will not detract from the confidence with which I give you my opinions, but don't be fooled. I mean, the Israeli, for me, the decisive break point was October 7th, and everything since then has been a consequence of that. And the changes have sort of increased in rapidity almost exponentially as we move closer and closer to the present time. In terms of the key changes for Iran, and just like you can't stick your foot in the same river twice, talking about Iran today is different than a week ago and a month ago. Regime change to a large extent has already happened and is happening, unfortunately. So, yeah, Iran has three pillars of its defensive strategy. The possibility of nuclear breakout, its system of proxies, and its missiles. Those are all gone. So the defensive strategy and the people who designed and implemented it are deader than vaudeville. They're gone. So in terms of day after thinking, Iran is going to have to do a lot of, once it emerges from the tactical mess it's in, a lot of strategic thinking to figure out where they go from here. They say generals always fight the last war, so the generals in Iran right now, even now as the ceasefire, inshallah, holds, will begin to start planning to prevent the war that in effect they've already lost. In terms of regime change, in the conventional sense, I don't see it happening. There were no signs during this, whatever you want to call it, war, conflict, dust-up, misunderstanding, that no signs that Iran's ability for internal control weakened. There was a significant rally around the flag effect. There is no, even though, I think I tweeted this at some point, even though there's many brave and dedicated, principled Iranians, both inside Iran and outside the country, dedicated to bringing about a better government for the Iranian people, there's no Iranian opposition. So it's a misnomer to talk of a regime change. You can talk about, as Israel did, regime degradation or incapacitation or instability, which was admittedly one of the three war goals of Israel. Israel, when it started this, said, we want to get rid of Iran's nuclear infrastructure to eliminate the nuclear threat. Parenthetically, that has not happened. We want to get rid of Iran's missile production capability. That largely has happened. And we want to get rid of Iran's ability to promote its axis of terrorism. We could talk about that later. Then they also said we want to rid ourselves of this troublesome Iranian regime. So instead of both trying to they're not trying, as the U.S. is trying to do, to modify Iranian intentions, as we were trying to do at the diplomatic table. They're just trying to eliminate Iranian capabilities. So in terms of diplomacy now, this is my final point, if in fact the U.S. and Iran return to the table, Israel will be a virtual presence there because I think they feel they've bought themselves the right to have a say in whatever final deal comes out. But I don't think Iranian red lines have changed. And it will be interesting to see what the U.S. tries to do in new solutions. So that's my initial take, and I'll bounce it back.
Thank you, Alan. Mona, maybe I can follow up with you and see if you could tease out just a little bit where you think the diplomatic effort is going to go. How do you see diplomacy taking over from what has been up to now? I mean, there was initial diplomacy, but then it folded into a military conflict. If the ceasefire holds, we could be headed back into diplomacy. How do you see that diplomacy being shaped? Who will be the players, and what will be the outcomes?
Thanks, Bill, and thanks to the Arab Gulf States Institute. It's an honor to be on this panel and to be with all of you this morning. So, I mean, I think the prospects for diplomacy this morning are certainly far better than they were 24 hours ago. But I don't know what we can say about what they'll be 24 hours from now. So, I mean, this has been a series of 180s, honestly, that have been so dizzying. I was just talking to someone earlier this morning. I don't think anyone really knows where we are in terms of what is the trajectory. But I do think there are a couple points that are clear here. One is, well, we are in the midst of a ceasefire. It is quite shaky, and any of us who have worked on the Middle East understand the nature of ceasefires, that they are indeed rather difficult to predict and to stabilize and to frankly turn into more permanent peace. So that I think goes without saying. But that being said, I guess there are a couple of points that I would highlight that for me suggest that perhaps there is a possibility now that diplomacy really could take hold. I don't want to sound naive or overly idealistic, but let me at least raise a couple of those points and then, of course, shoot those points down and make sure we all are aware of all the pitfalls as well that lie ahead. The first is, I think, if we look at Iran's retaliation against the U.S., it seems quite clear that it was choreographed to be telegraphed in order to make sure there was enough time for the U.S. To evacuate the base, to prepare, and indeed, President Trump even thanked Iran for letting us know in advance. So much for theater. But anyway, I mean, he sort of pulled the curtain back. But okay, not really supposed to do that. But anyway, but I think it's really important to understand that, because I think it highlights that the Iranians are in such a weakened position that they were really not interested in undertaking a response that would have goaded the U.S. or impelled the U.S. to respond again even more strongly. And so they had to pick that middle road. They had to thread the needle between nothing or not enough to look like there was anything there and too much. And I think they did it. And of course, they have practice in doing this. They did this in 2020 after the killing of Qasem Soleimani. It was almost the exact playbook. And it ended the exact same way in the sense of no U.S. casualties and a climb down from hostilities for now. So there's that point. The second point is it does seem that for now, and I really always now say for now with President Trump, that he is interested in pursuing the path of diplomacy. I don't think the Trump administration is interested in getting involved in an open-ended conflict with Iran. I think they've made quite clear, and I think his hope when these strikes were announced, and there's lots of understandable skepticism that this would be one and done. We've gone in with all of our literally big guns, our biggest guns, and have cowed the Iranians and have, quote unquote, obliterated their nuclear capability. That I would question. And I say this because what's interesting is that Trump this morning was quite angry at both Iran and Israel for violating the ceasefire, and then apparently got on the phone with Prime Minister Netanyahu and said, "Thou shalt not strike again, like turn your planes around." And I mean, he has the leverage and the political capital to do that and demand that, given what the U.S. has just done. And so the Israelis have complied. So I think those two factors in particular, I think, are important to note, that there could be some momentum. The third point I'll make in favor of diplomacy, and then quickly kick me if I'm going on too long, Bill. The third point would be, I do think that there's increasingly an understanding that this complex challenge of Iran's nuclear capabilities cannot be simply bombed out of existence. There are all kinds of technical questions about even the extent of damage to various elements of its infrastructure. There's this question of the missing, or where is it? Where's Waldo? Where's the 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium? It seems pretty clear that they moved it out of Ferdo, given the imagery showing trucks and so forth out, prior to this. So we see the limitations of kinetic action, and also I think those whose pay grades far higher than mine will suggest that really this kind of complex challenge demands at a certain point that diplomacy come in and actually begin to address Iran's intentions and where it is going. And so I do think that that suggests that we perhaps are at that point. There are so those are the arguments in favor. The arguments against are, basically that we are in a highly unstable situation, and it's not clear that certainly it's not clear to me that the Israelis are done with what they need to do. I think this idea that, no, actually Iran does still have some sort of nuclear capability left, when Prime Minister Netanyahu stated unequivocally that this cannot be the case. So there could be that driver of additional strikes. There are questions about Israel's ultimate ambitions. I love the term regime degradation as opposed to regime change. We've certainly seen lots of language that suggests that the Islamic Republic really for the Israelis is simply a non-starter in terms of its remaking of the Middle East. So I think there are drivers there. And of course, there's Iran also that is, I think, seeking to continue to demonstrate its ability to respond. It has been very much degraded, its missiles degraded, its proxies degraded, although not entirely, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a little bit. And so I do think, it would be naive to think that, okay, good, we're good and we're moving into diplomacy. I think that we remain in an incredibly precarious moment right now, and there are all kinds of X factors out there that could very easily tip this back into conflict, unfortunately.
Thank you, Mona. Kristin, if I could maybe offer you two avenues for opening some remarks on this issue. One is you recently wrote a piece about the Gulf states and not being very actively involved in the diplomacy. Just give you a chance if you want to follow up what Mona has said about the diplomacy and see where you think that could lead. And have you been surprised about Gulf participation or lack of participation in the overall crisis so far? And then if I could maybe ask you to just assess the reactions of Gulf governments so far to the crisis, including if there's anything overnight, but just if you could curate that a little bit. Have they all responded the same way? What have they been focused on in their responses? And has it evolved in what they're focused on and what they're worried about?
Thank you, Bill. Well, let me start first with your latter question so we know on the table kind of what the Gulf states have done. First off, they initially, when the Israelis attacked Iran, there was formal condemnation from all of the Gulf states, as well as the GCC collectively. It was actually quite strong condemnation, quite sharp, especially in the case of Oman, who issued the first statement. Of course, Oman was the one that was hosting the negotiations, so I think they felt quite upset that they had said, we're having a meeting in like 2 days. So Oman, the sharpest one, Qatar as well, quite sharp, and even Saudi Arabia, basically calling for an immediate halt to the attacks, and calling on everyone to realize that. I think you could see the Abraham Accord states also very strong condemnation, I have to say, but a little bit more balance about kind of de-escalation, kind of putting the onus on both sides. Now, after the United States then attacked Fordo, it's interesting that they, again, all of them did formally condemn the United States intervention as well. They leaned quite heavily onto international law language, talking about the sovereignty of Iran had been violated. And also, Qatar quite specifically spoke about the legality, actually, of and the right of Iran to have a nuclear program that's properly looked over by the IAEA. So I thought that was interesting. So what that kind of gives us a picture of it. And I should also mention that they kept up very active diplomacy during the whole thing, speaking to people, both Western powers, each other Middle Eastern powers, and directly with Iran. So the communication with Iran did not end, and that includes speaking with the foreign minister as well as with the president, the top people head to head. So I think the second question then is sort of like, well, is that surprising? And I would say, of course, it's not where the Gulf states were at one time before. We know that the Gulf states, famously under King Abdullah, were calling on the U.S. very actively all the time to be much more interventionist and to go in and cut the head off the snake. So I think what we see, though, is the Gulf states have held to their more recent position, which is, in the wake of the 2009 attack on their oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, we can see a pretty distinct shift in the Gulf states working towards greater détente with Iran. I think there was a calculation that they couldn't quite rely on the United States to the degree that they thought they could, and that Iran was a much greater threat, and that maybe diplomacy was a better way to go with Iran, to take themselves to not be the direct target in between. Because that is basically what they are, and some people can question that. But of course, Iran, one of the threats for retaliation that they have, that they can kind of, in their escalation, is of course to directly attack their neighboring states and the oil facilities within these states, which then causes broader pain. So everybody understands this, the oil states understand this as well. It is interesting to note that they have avoided that, right? Even when the U.S. did this massive attack that they did not do it from the bases. I mean, they did it all the way from the United States. So I think it's interesting that they have held to that position. And I think there is something else that's shifting here too, and we can get into it more later, but that is the Israeli role in the region changing post-October 7th? And I think the Gulf states have to really calculate about this. I mean, we have seen Israel willing to take a much more offensive position, whether that be in Gaza or, even in the West Bank, in ways that can disrupt the overall stability of neighboring states as well, not just on the Palestinians, but also maybe engaging on Jordan and Egypt. And we've seen, of course, the interventions in Lebanon, which I'm sure the Gulf states were very sad to see Hezbollah degraded, eliminated. But at the same time, to see Israel kind of on taking a position there, as well as in Syria, where they have a rather forward position. So I think there is some concern about, exactly what Israel's intent is in the region, and I think there's some sense about a need for some kind of balance. So that also is going into their calculation now. Of course, the last stage of what has happened in the last few days, we did see one of the Gulf states directly attacked. I mean, the attack was on the U.S. base in Qatar, but that's a direct missile attack from Iran on Qatar. And so there's a good question to ask, what now? How is that going to change their calculation? And the condemnation, of course, of that attack was very rapid and very strong by all of the Gulf states. Of course, I found it fascinating that after that attack took place, the Trump administration turned directly to Qatar and said, okay, now you make sure that Iran will now hold to a ceasefire. So it shows you that, I mean, the idea that this was sort of orchestrated and understood by the Qatar government, and that they do still have amongst the Gulf states the closer ties with Iran. But I don't think we should minimize that that's still an attack on, a Gulf state. I mean, it took place in their territory, and that precedent has been set. So there may be some kind of different calculations in how they're thinking. I think for the moment, though, for the Gulf states, their overall priority is not to allow this whole conflict to expand. They really are worried about just expanding zones of insecurity within the broader region. We could talk about Iraq and then extending into Syria. And of course, we had the attack, the terrorist attack by ISIS in Syria, just as a reminder, I think, to all of us that there are a lot of territories out there that are not at all stable. And so I think throwing a hugely important country like Iran into that zone of absolute instability is not something that the Gulf states want to see happen.
Thank you, Kristin. Really interesting perspectives on the role of Gulf reactions is playing and the role of their diplomacy. We'll move this along a little bit, Alan, but I just wanted to also give you the chance, if you had any observations you wanted to make about the prospects for diplomacy sort of taking over and shaping this crisis going forward.
I mean, briefly, I'm not, when you're a diplomat, you have to be cautiously optimistic. Now that I'm retired, I can be wildly pessimistic. So I'm not too, I think diplomacy, as I said in my previous comments, is going to be very hard. Iran is not going to come to the table and say, please don't do it again. We will agree to no enrichment on our soil. We'll agree to stop missile production, and we'll stop funding those pesky proxies. That's not going to happen. They're going to dig in. Yeah, this has been, I started following Iran in 1984 during the Iran-Iraq War. This has replaced, I think, for many Iranians, the Iran-Iraq War as the motivating trauma that's going to guide them going forward, as I alluded to previously. So, I mean, I think the U.S. will declare victory. I think President Trump wants to move on. I think everyone's doing a victory lap. I think his attention, the U.S. administration attention to this will decrease. I think the U.S., unfortunately, government's capability to address this in an optimal manner, and I don't say this out of partisanship, has decreased. There's been a diminished role for the State Department, for the NSC. I think poor Mr. Witkoff has a very large plate in terms of all the things he's being asked to do. So I think the U.S. role, paradoxically, will be less than it has been and less than it should be. To a large extent, Israel's still driving the train. The central dynamic didn't change since day one. Israel moves down its target list. Okay? I mean, the U.S. bombing of the Fordo and these two other places was a terrifying sideshow, but just to put a bow on it, I would be pleasantly surprised if we get any sort of diplomatic motion or momentum as a result of what's happened in the last 11 days. And don't forget, we've still got snapback in mid-October. We've got the UNSCR, which, unless somebody does something, is going to lift UN sanctions on Iran come mid-October. So, yeah, tough situation.
Yeah. Iran gets a vote, but I guess the UN Security Council also gets a vote of sorts. Yeah. Mona, Kristin was talking a little bit about Israel's role in the region. I wanted to tease that out a little bit. What do you think this crisis has done to Israel's pursuit of normalization with Gulf countries? Has the Iran crisis damaged the prospects for the normalization, or had any impact on the Abraham Accord agreements that have been made, or is it largely a storm that has now passed, as some analysts say, and it won't have the kind of impact that, say, the Gaza crisis has had? What's your perception on that?
I'd like to just say one quick thing based on Alan's comments, which I meant to say before, because I think it's really important, and I would completely associate myself with this idea of a motivating trauma.
I thought you were going to come against me.
No. You reminded me of something that I think is critical to put down, because I think you're absolutely right about Iran and what its takeaways are. And I think it's important to lay down that one of its key takeaways may be that it must pursue a nuclear weapon, and that we talk about the key deterrent elements it had: missiles largely degraded, proxies largely unraveled, and frankly, again, it looks to the North Korea example. I know I'm not the first person to say this, it's been out there about in punditry, but I do think it's important to really lay down that Iran could well make the decision that its best recourse at this point is a sprint to even a crude nuclear weapon, which I would argue, therefore, again, highlights why diplomacy is so important. Now, whether diplomacy can resolve that or not is a very, very open question. But I did want to just sort of put a bow on your bow and say that. Damage prospects for normalization. Well, I mean, I think the prospects for normalization were pretty well in the deep freeze prior to all of this. And, you know, I think, and I'm not saying you're doing this, Bill, but I think sometimes analytically one may compartmentalize a little bit. Gaza and then this. And I don't think that's the case in the region. I think that the region, since October 7th and beyond, and Israel's military response, starting in Gaza, then Lebanon, then, you know, also now Syria in terms of the occupation of increasingly bigger swaths of Syria. It's, you know, hurling missiles at Yemen. Again, not unprovoked. So I want to be very clear. This is definitely a conflict. But I was speaking to a colleague the other day in the Gulf, and he said, you know, there's a madman running around the region right now with a gun, and it isn't Iran, it's Israel. And so I do think that given what we have witnessed over the past 20 months since Gaza and these incredible reverberations, which we can talk about, to include Syria, I would add, and now what we have seen over the last 12 days, I think the region is incredibly wary of Israel and the role that it is playing. And this notion of establishing hegemony over the region through military force, I think is extremely disquieting for the region, that it is setting the region on a path. There weren't many, and arguably no guardrails, but we really are in a Hobbesian, we are looking over the abyss of a Hobbesian Middle East, in which there really are no rules of the game, and might makes right. And I think for the region, which is so fatigued from more than 2 decades of conflict, this utterly upends that vision that they were promoting, which in their minds potentially could have included normalization with Israel. I mean, that was certainly the path prior to October 7th, but also, and my colleagues may push back on this, also included integration of Iran. Because I think the watershed moment was 2019 with the attack on Abqaiq, and a decision and an understanding that, you know what, this ain't working for us. And I think an understanding Iran is here to stay, and we need to figure out a way to integrate them into the region. And this vision of de-escalation of conflict, of diversification of economies, of building out ties across the region to include maybe even, you know, now Syria and Lebanon, is a region that is a vision that really is founded on ending conflicts and not the perpetuation of conflict. And so I think, in a sense, what the Gulf has just witnessed is their nightmare scenario, and I think that therefore they are quite concerned about the role that Israel is playing, and that's going to make them, unfortunately, think more wary. I don't think there's a view that the storm is past, and this is a country that they can now quickly return to normalcy and do business with. Over.
Interesting. So, I mean, if I hear you right, you do believe that there are some consequences, maybe indirect, but that are going to reverberate over time with the whole paradigm of normalization with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, let's be clear. The Abraham Accord countries have maintained that, so that those haven't been deep sixed and that they were blown up. So yes, but no, I do. I think that this is really giving the region pause as to how to proceed and what role Israel is going to be playing and how do they manage that. And I think that they are right now quite wary and concerned about the role that Israel is playing.
Kristin, could I follow up with you on this issue? What are you hearing from Gulf, either officials or in the media or people you speak to about this issue of a sort sort of the Gulf waking up and before sensing there was this huge sort of balance between Iran on the one hand and Israel on the other, and they're waking up to this reality of just it's Israel as this super dominant military power out in the region. Is it giving people pause? Do you sort of agree with the scenario that Mona has laid out, or do you see it a little differently?
Well, just to be add something new to the conversation, I'll be a little bit more of a cynic. I think I stated the position, and I think that is how the Gulf states are seeing it. And I think particularly this government in Israel is particularly difficult to deal with. I mean, if you look at a country like the UAE, which was turning to Israel as a way, to some extent, to counter what they saw as a lot of extremism and that comes out of Islamist movements and that kind of thing in the region. And now you've got kind of, some of the leadership, some of the people within the Israeli government are equally, quite fanatical. So I think it's a big problem for all the states, including the Abraham Accord states. I will just say, though, that I think the strategy that the Abraham Accord states took, really particularly the UAE, was one of thinking strategically about where the region was going and expecting kind of what Alan Eyre has described, that the U.S. is just not going to be as invested. They're not going to be there to solve all our problems. They're not going to be doing all that diplomacy. They may not even be here to protect us to the degree that we need. So we need to look at the other powers in the region and decide what's going to be most beneficial for us, as the Gulf states that have, they have been increasing their own capabilities militarily. Obviously, their bigger capabilities are really in their huge investments and their move towards more technological sophistication and being the sort of hub for a global economy. And I think when they looked at Israel, they saw this could be a quite attractive partner in the sense of what they can offer, both in terms of intelligence, military kind of capabilities, but also in terms of technology, how their economy was, and all of these sorts of things. So I think, Israel looked like sort of a winning bet if you want to kind of lean towards a country that may help you in the balance of this new Hobbesian region. I really think Saudi Arabia was maybe looking at that, and it's a much more difficult calculation for Saudi Arabia, but maybe thinking like, okay, maybe that was a good bet. They're getting some advantages from this. But I see at least Saudi Arabia quite distinctively shifting kind of in this current environment, and especially what's been going on in Gaza, and thinking about the region. And Saudi Arabia has been really quite strong in trying to hold back Israel. I mean, of course, just before this conflict happened, the other consequence of it was that Saudi Arabia and France were supposed to be holding a summit at the UN to try to push other states to start to recognize Palestine directly as a way to kind of stop the bleeding there and have a legal principle to start to hold the Palestinians in place instead of seeing them being kind of driven from their territory. So I really do think that Saudi Arabia is looking at it differently. Their cooperation, too, on Syria looks a bit more distinct and is bringing them a little bit closer to Turkey, which is interesting, the other kind of power in the region, as Iran is a bit lessened. But I think what's happened recently, I don't know how those states will calculate that in a Hobbesian environment. I do see distinctions in their strategies, so that could play out over the long time if Israel emerges as utterly the strongest power. Maybe the UAE will want to double down on that a bit, but I just say it's a much more difficult environment to work in right now, though.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kristin. Alan, Iran. This is really maybe the final question on Iran until we go to the audience and see if they have questions they want to follow up. Iran has friends, Russia, China, India, of course. They haven't been very evident in this crisis, offering much help. How do you think Iran is going to be able to operate going forward with any help from friends, or are they on their own and the regime's been degraded and it's just going to stay weak?
At the risk of contradicting you, and I see Ali smiling, Iran has no friends. And this experience has reinforced that. There's a great saying in Persian that says basically, no one scratches my back other than the nail of my own finger. Iran realized during the Iran-Iraq war that the international community was no help, that it was on it alone. If you ever listen to Khamenei in Persian, he's always talking about khod kafai muqawamat, which is khod kafai is by yourselfness. What is that? Self-sufficiency, thanks. Self-sufficiency and resistance. So this has reinforced Iran in thinking they're on it by themselves. Now they have allies. I mean, Syria up until recently, was the only Arab country that was that backed it during the Iran-Iraq war. So that was a long-term strategic alliance. But the mindset in Iran right now is we are on our own at a time when, even before this started, Iran was on its heels. Its economy was horrible. It was having rolling blackouts that was cutting needed electricity to its industry, to homes, massive inflation, high inflation, unemployment, water shortages, problems relating to climate change. So Iran was not flourishing before this happened. And right now, as a result of all of this, it's going to get even worse. And unfortunately, Iran's going to have to be militarizing at the same time. So at a time when it even needs to focus even more on getting its own house in order, it won't be doing that. So much for butter. We need more guns. And again, Iran, sure, Russia will help. Russia has helped in the UN. China will help at the UN. Everyone will profit off of Iran's economic infirmities. China will get an even better deal on oil. But, Iran has got some serious reacting to do.
Thank you. Just a question, Kristin, I wonder if you would, I think you mentioned it, but just if you'd say a few words about the Gaza conflict and how that either folds into this Iran model or paradigm, or if it doesn't fold in, but it's just there and looms as in some ways an even greater catastrophe really in the region that the Gulf countries are trying to deal with and trying to navigate their way forward with?
Well, I think we've already kind of said quite a bit about it, that, October 7th is a big turning point. I think I agree with you in where we are right now. And it's worth underlining again that this occurred, through an attack by Hamas at a time when everybody was trying to move on, right? Like, okay, we can just cauterize this Palestinian problem. Something in there with Israel, but, we've got bigger fish to fry. We've got other things. We've got our massive big plans. If we do put all of this conflict that we've had in the last few years, all of, which has now come down to actual states, Israel and Iran bombing each other directly. And now we have Iran directly bombing Qatar. It does kind of underline that the ability of this Palestinian, the inability to address the tragedy, really, of Palestinians never having a place for themselves or any kind of future to them, how it can still cause this kind of instability in the region. So I think probably we're moving in a period of nationalism. I think a lot of the states were hoping to just be able to focus on their own interests. Palestine doesn't have a state, so they're kind of left out of the whole thing. But I think it just shows you that there are these trends and these things that pull at the commonalities amongst the states too that haven't completely disappeared. And so I think it is really concerning. I think that kind of image that we have now, these big states that are, trying to play this big role as the center hubs of these new technology and pursuing their own national interests. You know, we still have the Palestinian issue isn't dealt with. Syria is still out there. We just had ISIS do another attack. These kinds of things are still sort of elements that are going to require a lot of attention at a period when I don't know where the attention is going to come from.
Thank you, Kristin. We have about 10 minutes. I think I'll open it up and ask questions. Doug, you have one? Yep.
I'm going to exercise my right as kind of the guy in charge of this to ask the first question, because I've been trying to put myself in the mind of Donald Trump and what he is actually thinking about the future of Iran. Over the course of the past several months, he has said a number of things that are very positive about Iran, his desire for Iranian people to prosper. You know that Iran can now sell more oil to China. American companies want to invest in Iran and build the Iranian economy. Maybe this is really directed at Alan. Is there anything here that would resonate at all with the Iranian regime, the Iranian people? Is this an opportunity that Trump is trying to reframe U.S. relations with Tehran in the way that I think his trip a month and a half ago tried to reframe America's relations with the Gulf? In other words, focus on commercial benefit and economic development.
That's a great question. I do think President Trump is unique in that he does not seem to share the visceral historical dislike, loathing of Iran that has been ambient in the U.S. government since 1979. You know, he was willing to do a deal with North Korea. He's willing to do a deal with Iran. But on the Iranian side, no. You know, Iran does not trust the U.S. The prevailing mindset that guides Iranian strategy is that regardless of what the U.S. says, the United States and its pawn Israel, in Iranian thinking, is trying to topple, not only is trying to topple the Iranian government, that's all it thinks about, okay? Ayatollah Khamenei and the ethos and the mindset that will survive him once he dies, unless, you know, they pick Hassan Khomeini to replace him, which is an interesting possibility, is that the U.S. is hell-bent on getting rid of the Islamic Republic. And also, the people running Iran, final point, they don't want an American investment. Sweet goodness, the IRGC is making lots of money off this enmity. So we saw this with JCPOA. They don't want to open to the West. God forbid, that kills their nest egg.
Thank you. Marcel, did you have a question?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for a great panel, a very depressing one. But I'd like to share, as a retired State Department diplomat, I share Alan Eyre's wildly cynical perspective on the region. And I have a comment and maybe would welcome your feedback. I mean, you've all said exactly what I agree with in terms of we have an Iran now that is degraded, weakened, but it's not going to lay over and play dead. So in their minds, the first thing to do is to go after as much as they can towards a nuclear capability. At the same time, I think we have a region that hasn't been able to exercise any leverage, at least that I can see, on the role that Israel is playing. And I agree we have a seemingly strong and interventionist president, but I think I agree with what you said earlier, Alan, that in terms of the U.S. taking a very dynamic leading role in putting together a peace process or a regional perspective that would stabilize the region, I don't think they have the strength or the capacity. So from my perspective, Israel is really the strongest player here. And I don't think the Israeli government is at this point in time interested or cares about, you know, expanding normalization with Saudi Arabia. They don't have much leverage on Israel. In my view, I wonder if you share it, I think Israel has a very clear strategy of not only degrading Iran, but being completely in control of the region and marginalizing anybody that is a threat to Israel. And I think that includes the Palestinians, very much so, what we're seeing in the West Bank and Gaza. And I think from the Gulf states' perspective, they look at this and they see if everything implodes, especially on the Palestinian issue, that has a lot of stability ramifications for them. But at the same time, I really do feel that their hands are tied in terms of how they can influence Israel. So my bottom line is that the real players here is Israel is going to be calling the shots for quite some time, whether we look at Syria or Iran or the Palestinians. So my question to you all, it's really a domestic question. Do we think America has the wherewithal to play a role that promotes stability? It has to support Israel's security, but Israel's hegemony is a very different ballgame here. And I think it has ramifications for U.S. interests in the region. So we really should be talking about Israel and the United States more than anyone else in the region.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Marcel. Maybe take one more question, and we'll allow one of the members of the panel to address both of those sets of issues. Ali, you had a question?
Good morning, and thank you for your brilliant presentations. I have a very, very short comment and a question. The comment is that the IRGC was really never against a nuclear agreement with the U.S. They did not oppose the JCPOA. Why? Because they were hoping that they could engage in joint ventures with U.S. companies. So they were not opposing the influx of foreign direct investments into Iran, not at all. And the problem, obviously, was the terrorist designation of the IRGC during the first Trump administration, which made it completely impossible for IRGC-owned businesses to engage in that kind of businesses with foreign companies. The question is more about the debate among IRGC strategists. What they are telling right now, and they have been telling this actually for some time, is that Iran's détente with Saudi Arabia was a mistake, because it persuaded the world that Iran would not be bombing the regional oil infrastructure. In other words, the US could attack Iran and it would not entail any cost for the global economy. And therefore they argued that in the future, Iran should be doing the same thing as the DPRK did with South Korea. They took the city of Seoul hostage. They said, if you bomb our nuclear facilities, we will bomb Seoul with our artillery. Now, if it is technically feasible for Iran to build a nuclear weapon now, would it not be natural to expect the IRGC to take the regional oil infrastructure hostage?
Interesting question. Let's take one more question, and then I'll give panel members a chance to respond to what they've heard and wrap up with a short minute each.
Thanks very much. I just had a sort of quick clarifying question. I mean, I think we've all come to this point where we think it's very probable that Iran is racing for breakout of some kind of nuclear capability, crude bomb, whatever it is. Could I just hear some thoughts about what does that really look like? What is that? I mean, it's presumably not rebuilding a lot of this infrastructure. Is it? Do they get help from anyone abroad? We heard they don't have any friends, but are there factions in wherever, North Korea, Russia, Pakistan, whatever it might be, that could support them doing that? Like, what does it mean? What's the timeline for something like that? Just to have a demonstration of some nuclear capability that gives them a little bit of security.
And let's see. Yes, one final remark or question?
Yeah, hi. So most of my questions have been answered, but I have one question that you can provide insight on. What is this equation between Trump and Netanyahu relationship? Does he trust we have seen a lot of comments from President Trump. So I was wondering how much leverage he has on Netanyahu to end this crisis. So I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. So I think probably with the time, I'll give you each maybe a minute to wrap up. A lot has been expressed in the audience about Iran's possible race for a bomb. Marcel's interesting comments, which also fold into the last speaker's comments about the domestic situation and how the U.S. is going to possibly deal with this new situation in the Middle East, where Israel is appearing to be so dominant going forward. So I'll give each of you a minute to tackle any pieces of those you'd like to. Mona, shall I let you start?
Sure. Lots there. Let me maybe try to tackle this question, Ambassador Wehby, that you raised about Israel and versus the Gulf. And I mean, for me, I would note, in my view, kind of to this point about October 7th being a watershed, I would note even before that the region is has been at a hinge moment. We are definitely seeing, you know, the old order that had prevailed for decades vanishing, a new order emerging, and competing visions for that order. And I think we're seeing it now in stark relief, in a sense, of Israel, you know, through military might seeking to establish some sort of hegemony. I guess I would not, number one, 100% count that that's the way things will go. I think Israel itself has issues, bandwidth issues. It's already stretched quite thin in terms of some of these various conflicts it's engaged in, and also that there are economic implications for what has happened. Israel cannot wage war for years on end. Already they're engaged in the longest conflict that they've been engaged in since their history. So there's some constraints on the Israeli side, and I guess I'd say on the regional side, on the Gulf side in particular, in this emerging order, it's my view that the Gulf is the center of gravity, and I think we need to really pick through and understand better the agency they bring to the table, which I would argue is quite significant. I think this last go-round of the past several months has been probably, I would think, a real wake-up call for the region about how to more effectively use its leverage, how to think more strategically, how to insulate against what, when I was in Oman a month ago, they were fearing, that actually the talks are moving. Actually, the Iranians are interested in billion and trillion dollar deals, and they have learned to speak the language of Trump and even tweet in the language of Trump, with the case of AGSI in all caps. And that I think the region actually felt it was on the verge of something significant, and then the whole thing was derailed. And I think it's on strategists in the region to really sit back and take some lessons here and learn. But the battle for the regional order is far from over, is what I think.
Thank you, Mona. Kristin, any wrap-up remark?
Just to Ali's comments and also following on Mona about the Gulf states, I do think that they're the center, and especially when we have the vision that they want to have, they're the center, which means we have a relatively stable region with investment, with lots of trade going back and forth, then they're the center. When it turns into this kind of landscape, I'm not so sure that the center of the bombs flying, missiles flying back and forth over their heads. So I think their ability is a bit more limited. I think we should recognize, and as Ali kind of underlined, that they were able to change the strategic calculus of Iran in this conflict. Iran has not struck any of the, a Petro Diplomacy thing. They have not struck oil facilities anywhere, primarily in the Gulf states. And I think that is because now Iran had something to lose, because they actually have made those deals and those understandings with the Gulf states. If they attack them, then they could lose those. So their actions have had consequences, but they're just not always the absolute decisive ones. And I think for the Gulf states, a lot of the things that they want to achieve, they can't do it on their own. They need a platform for doing things, and then they can do their investments. They can move quite well. But if the United States is not, like on Syria, I mean, when they talked them into lifting sanctions on Syria, then the Gulf states could move in and be very effective in trying to stabilize that situation. But they needed the U.S. to move first. And I think if we look to this question of the U.S. not being as strong a player, I mean, who made the arrangement between the détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran? It was China. Who is Saudi Arabia turning to now to try to calm or at least have some kind of diplomatic framework moving forward on Gaza? It was the French and Europe. So I think it just shows you that they're not finding the partner that they need to try to create this more stable environment where they can be the most influential partners out there.
Thank you, Kristin. Alan, 40 seconds? We're running up against the time.
Sure. I mean, I don't think the JCPOA was a fork in the road. I think the last fork in the road in bilateral relations with the U.S. was the Serie B Conoco deal in '93 with Archie Dunham that went sideways at the last second. Secondly, I don't like the word race in terms of racing for a nuclear weapon. Iran is very deliberate. One of the things we saw with the Qatar strike was that the same conservative, prudent, risk-averse thinking that could have died with all the Iranian generals who died is still there. So they will move toward a nuclear weapon or closer to it, but they're really good at diplomacy. Europe, although largely irrelevant, will play a role, at least because they're the only ones who can do snapback, the E3. So Iran will lobby Europe, and also Iran will be focusing on the Gulf countries, on KSA and the UAE, because they know that those guys have President Trump on speed dial.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.